Okay, so get ready for this. Today we're going to deep dive into climate change, but with a
I'll do
twist.
those too.
Yeah, we're looking at how climate change is impacting the LGBTQIA plus community,
Interesting.
specifically in Southeast Asia.
Okay.
And the source material for this deep dive is this article from Nonprofit Quarterly called Queer and Fighting for Climate Justice in Southeast Asia.
Right.
It was published pretty recently, just on November 8th of this year.
Gotcha.
And one of the things that really struck me about this article is how it just starts off with this really powerful story
Oh.
about this Malaysian youth activist named Adil Iman Aidid. And he was actually disinvited from a climate event
Oh.
because of his, his activism in queer rights.
Mm.
And it kind of sets the stage for what the whole article's about.
Yeah, it sounds like a really kind of stark example of the double marginalization that these communities often face.
Exactly.
Having to deal with the impacts of climate change, but also facing discrimination and exclusion at the same time.
And especially, in a region like Southeast Asia,
Right.
which is already incredibly vulnerable to climate change.
It's one of the most at-risk regions in the world, right?
Yeah, so we're talking about countries like Myanmar, the Philippines, and Thailand.
Yeah.
They're consistently ranked among the top 10 most at-risk countries globally, and that's according to the Global Climate Risk Index.
Wow, top 10. That's pretty serious.
Yeah, so you've got this region that's already dealing with these incredible vulnerabilities, and then you have LGBTQIA plus communities facing these additional hurdles.
Yeah, and on top of everything else.
And one of the things the article talks about is this idea of climate change being a threat multiplier. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so threat multiplier is this powerful way of describing how climate change doesn't just create new problems, it actually makes existing problems worse.
Okay.
So it's like, you're already dealing with poverty, discrimination, lack of access to healthcare.
Yeah.
And then climate change comes along and just throws a wrench in the works.
Right. It just makes everything that much harder.
Exactly. It amplifies all those issues.
So it's not just about, the direct impacts of climate change, like rising sea levels or
Right.
extreme weather events. It's also about how those events exacerbate the inequalities that already exist.
Exactly. One of the researchers in the article, Beatrice Quintos, she had a really good analogy.
Oh,
She said it's kind of like that movie, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once.
I love that movie.
Yeah. So imagine all these overlapping crises like poverty, discrimination, all happening at the same time.
Yeah.
And then climate change comes along and just throws everything into even more chaos.
Wow, so climate change is like the multiversal villain in this scenario.
Yeah. Making everything so much more difficult.
For those who are already struggling, yeah.
Exactly. And it's not just like natural events and disasters.
Right.
The article also talks about how policy and social structures can make things worse. For example, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations,
Yeah.
they have all these documents on gender equality, but they almost always just focus on women.
So even in policies aimed at addressing inequality,
Right.
they're still overlooking a whole segment of the population.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's the case.
And so how does this kind of exclusion actually play out, in real life?
It manifests in a lot of ways, like from the workplace to even accessing aid during disasters.
Oh, wow.
There's this climate advocate from Thailand that the article talks about. They go by RED,
Okay.
and they even work in a relatively progressive environment.
Yeah.
But still, RED feels uncomfortable coming out of work.
Oh, wow.
Talks about this nervousness they sense from their straight male colleagues.
Especially about things like using non-binary pronouns.
Exactly.
It's like,
Yeah.
even in places that seem progressive on the surface, there can still be these subtle forms of exclusion
Right.
that make it difficult for people to be their authentic selves.
Yeah. And then on top of all that,
Yeah.
there's the legal landscape, which is it's just a whole other layer of complexity.
Okay.
We've seen some positive legal changes recently, like Thailand legalizing same-sex marriage.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, and Singapore repealed that law that criminalized sex between men.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's great progress.
Yeah.
But then at the same time,
Yeah.
you have Brunei, Malaysia, and Indonesia, where Sharia law criminalizes same-sex relationships.
Wow. So it's like you have these progressive laws in some places,
Right.
but then in other places, it's still incredibly,
Yeah, it's a really mixed bag.
yeah.
And even in the countries that are considered more tolerant, discrimination is still widespread.
Yeah.
So it's this tension.
Between the law and the reality on the ground.
Exactly.
And it's a reminder that legal progress,
Doesn't always translate into...
yeah, it doesn't always mean that people's lived experience is going to be better.
Right, exactly.
And that there's still a long way to go in terms of changing hearts and minds.
And religion plays a big role in all of this.
Oh.
In that gap between, what the law says and what actually happens.
Yeah.
This activist aided.
Yeah.
He shared some anecdotal reports about trans people actually being excluded from receiving aid during floods.
Oh, wow.
And this is because a lot of aid organizations in the region are religiously affiliated.
Okay.
And they don't accept trans individuals.
So wait, you're saying that during a natural disaster,
Yeah.
when people are at their most vulnerable, they're being turned away because of their gender identity.
That's what the article suggests is happening in some cases, which is just...
That's heartbreaking.
It is. It's truly heartbreaking. And,
know.
it highlights just how deep-seated some of these prejudices are.
Yeah.
And the fact that these individuals then have to rely on their own communities for support
Right.
just underscores the systemic barriers that they're up against.
It's like a double whammy.
It is, yeah.
Not only are they disproportionately impacted by climate change, right?
They're also excluded from the very systems that are supposed to help them cope.
Exactly. And this exclusion makes it even harder to advocate for themselves and their needs, which then just perpetuates this whole cycle of invisibility and marginalization.
It's just incredibly frustrating to see how these issues are so deeply intertwined.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how that makes it even harder for marginalized communities to have their voices heard and their needs met.
Yeah, and it makes me think about what Adid said in the article. He said, many environmentalists do not see LGBTQIA plus as allies or colleagues. They do not see the environmental issues as multidisciplinary.
Wow.
I think that quote really gets to the heart of the problem.
It sounds like he's saying that there's this perception that environmentalism and LGBTQIA plus rights are separate issues, when in reality, they're deeply connected.
They are, absolutely. And until we break down those silos and recognize that these issues are intersectional,
our efforts to address climate change are going to be incomplete.
And ineffective.
Yeah, it's like trying to solve a puzzle, but you only have half the pieces.
So what are some of the missing pieces in this puzzle? What are the things that are preventing us from seeing the full picture?
Well, I think the first step is really just acknowledging the ways in which LGBTQIA plus communities are being excluded and marginalized, and that's both in terms of policy and social attitudes. We need to understand why this exclusion is happening.
Right, like what are the root causes?
Exactly, if we want to start dismantling those barriers.
So before we can even start talking about solutions, we need to really understand the problem. And that means listening to the lived experiences of those who are most affected.
Absolutely, and that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, sounds good.
We'll be exploring some of the specific challenges that LGBTQIA plus people face in Southeast Asia. As well as hopefully some signs of progress that are emerging.
I'm looking forward to it. So we've talked about how climate change and LGBTQIA plus rights are really deeply intertwined, especially in a place like Southeast Asia. But where do we even go from here?
Right.
How do we even begin to address this really complex intersection of issues?
It's easy to feel overwhelmed, for sure.
Yeah.
But the article does offer some glimmers of hope.
Okay, that's good.
One of the things they point to is this need for a more multidisciplinary approach to climate action.
So instead of tackling these things separately, we need to start seeing how they're all connected.
Exactly. Climate change isn't just an environmental issue.
Right.
It's a social justice issue, an economic issue, a human rights issue.
Yeah.
And the same goes for LGBTQIA plus rights. They don't exist in isolation.
We're all interconnected. So how do we actually put this multidisciplinary approach into practice?
Right. How do we...
What does it look like?
Yeah. How do we actually do it? Well, first off, I think it means recognizing that LGBTQIA plus communities aren't just victims of climate change.
Right.
They can be real agents of change.
Yeah.
They bring unique experiences to the table.
Right.
And those perspectives are really important.
Absolutely.
For creating solutions that actually work.
So it's not just about including them in the conversation.
Right.
It's about actually making sure their voices are heard.
Yeah. And that their needs are met in a meaningful way.
Can you give me some concrete examples of what that might look like?
Sure. For instance, when we're talking about disaster relief efforts, we need to make sure that shelters and resources are LGBTQIA plus inclusive.
Right, because we were talking about how trans people are
Yeah.
sometimes excluded from shelters.
Exactly, because of discriminatory practices.
Yeah, that was a really upsetting part of the article.
It is, yeah. So we need to create spaces
Yeah.
where everyone feels welcome and respected.
Safe spaces.
Yes, regardless of their gender identity or sexual orientation.
And that goes beyond just physical safety.
It does. It includes their emotional and psychological well-being.
Right, because trauma and displacement can
Yeah.
have a huge impact on mental health.
Absolutely. And that impact can be even greater for marginalized communities.
Who are already facing so much.
Right, exactly. So making sure there's access to mental health services
Yeah.
that are culturally competent and LGBTQIA plus affirming, that's crucial.
Okay, so we've talked about disaster relief, healthcare. What are some other areas where this multidisciplinary approach is needed?
Well, education and awareness raising,
Okay.
those are hugely important.
To help get rid of some of those harmful stereotypes.
Yeah, we need to challenge those stereotypes and promote understanding and acceptance of LGBTQIA plus people.
Because dismantling that prejudice and discrimination is essential for creating a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Exactly. Education is one of the most powerful tools we have
Yeah.
for driving social change.
And, it's not just about educating the general public. It's also about educating people who work in the climate change sector.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Like giving them the knowledge and skills to work effectively with LGBTQIA plus communities.
Exactly. So, like, training them on how to create inclusive spaces.
Yeah.
Use gender-affirming language.
And address the specific needs
Right.
of LGBTQIA plus people.
Exactly. It's about capacity building.
Yeah.
Making sure that climate action is truly intersectional.
And inclusive.
Yeah.
And it also means promoting LGBTQIA plus leadership
Yes.
within the climate movement itself.
Absolutely.
Because if we want to see real change,
Mm-hmm.
we need to make sure that those most affected by the issues
Right.
are the ones leading the way.
Leading the charge, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's more than just token representation.
Right.
It's about creating spaces where they can thrive
Yeah.
and lead. And that means addressing those systemic barriers.
And building a culture of inclusion. Because diversity leads to
Innovation, more robust solutions.
Yeah.
But we also need to acknowledge the work that LGBTQIA plus organizations and activists are already doing.
They're on the front lines
Yeah.
of this fight.
Yeah, but they often lack funding and recognition.
Yeah.
So it's really important to support them
How can we do that?
by directing funding their way, amplifying their voices.
Giving them a platform
Exactly.
to share their expertise.
Yeah,
So it's about recognizing and valuing their contributions.
absolutely. They're essential partners
Yeah.
in this fight for climate justice.
And it's about empowering them
Yes,
to take ownership of climate action.
exactly. And to lead the way in creating solutions.
Which brings us back to that idea of agency. It's
Relative-
not about seeing LGBTQIA plus people as victims, but as powerful agents of change.
Exactly. And by supporting their leadership
Yeah.
and amplifying their voices.
We create a more just and sustainable future for everyone.
Exactly. It's about shifting the narrative.
From vulnerability to resilience.
Yes, from marginalization to empowerment.
So, if we want to achieve climate justice,
Mm.
we have to dismantle those systems of oppression
Yes.
and create a world where everyone, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity, can thrive.
And contribute
Yeah.
to a sustainable future.
It's a tall order, but we have to at least try.
We do, absolutely.
But it's not just about big picture solutions, right?
Right.
What can our listeners do to support this fight?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And one that we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, good.
We'll be talking about specific actions individuals can take
Perfect.
to make a difference, both in their communities and on a global scale.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive.
We have.
From the realities of climate change in Southeast Asia
Yeah.
to the challenges faced by the LGBTQIA plus community there.
Mm.
But before we wrap up, I want to focus on what gives me hope.
Oh.
Because despite all the challenges, there are some really bright spots.
There are, yeah. Amidst all the, the complexities and the setbacks,
Yeah.
there's this growing movement toward inclusion.
Okay.
That's really inspiring.
Yeah, and we talked about how disaster relief efforts are becoming more inclusive,
Right.
with more focus on the needs of LGBTQIA plus individuals.
Yeah, and that shift is happening in other areas too.
Okay, like what?
Well, like healthcare, for instance.
Okay.
The article mentioned that Vietnam established its first healthcare clinic.
Oh, wow.
That's specifically welcoming to the LGBTQIA plus community.
That's great.
Back in 2019. So
it's a huge step.
It is.
Towards making sure everyone has access to quality care.
Yeah, and affirming care too.
Right. It's so easy to get bogged down by all the problems.
Yep.
But it's important to highlight these positive developments.
Absolutely.
It shows that progress is possible.
It does, yeah. And this progress is largely due to the hard work of LGBTQIA plus activists and organizations.
Yeah, they're really pushing for change.
They are. And facing so many obstacles.
Yeah, like Adil Ayman,
Oh, yeah.
whose story we discussed earlier.
Right, being disinvited from that event.
Yeah, and his research was rejected.
Right.
But he's still committed to his activism.
He is. It's incredible.
He said, "Whenever I am rejected, I find another opportunity."
Wow, that's powerful.
Yeah, he's so resilient.
It really is.
And there are countless others like him who are driving this movement.
They're the ones making change happen.
It reminds us that change doesn't happen overnight.
No, it takes time.
Dedication.
A willingness to challenge the status quo.
Yeah.
And it's not just on the LGBTQIA plus community to do this work.
Right.
We all have to work together.
To create a more just and equitable world.
Yeah. And you touched on something really important earlier.
Oh.
Allyship.
Yeah.
That's crucial.
Yeah, those of us who aren't part of the LGBTQIA plus community, we have a responsibility to speak up. Challenge discrimination.
Support the fight for equality.
It's about recognizing our privilege and using it to amplify marginalized voices.
Exactly. Educating ourselves.
And others.
About the issue.
Challenging stereotypes.
Creating a culture of inclusivity and respect.
At the end of the day, it's about understanding that climate justice and LGBTQIA plus rights are interconnected.
We can't have one without the other.
Exactly.
Creating a sustainable future means dismantling all forms of oppression.
Yeah.
And making sure everyone has the right to a healthy planet.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
It's been a really eye-opening conversation.
It has.
I feel like I have a deeper understanding of these issues now.
Me too. And it's encouraging to see the work being done by activists and organizations.
The growing recognition of LGBTQIA plus rights.
The awareness that climate change impacts everyone differently.
It's all really encouraging.
It is. It shows that change is happening.
And we all have a role to play in shaping a more just and sustainable future.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final thought.
What concrete steps can you take
to support the fight for climate justice
and LGBTQIA plus rights in Southeast Asia and beyond?
We encourage you to reflect on this question.
And take action.
However small it may seem.
Every action, every voice raised, every conversation started.
It can all contribute to creating a world where everyone can thrive.
Remember, even small ripples can create big waves.